world that we live in is hard. So the supply chain industry, it goes through its ups and its downs, and sometimes it seems not very volatile, easy to predict, and things of that nature. But over the last few years, we've seen that that's not necessarily always been the case. Things like, the macroeconomic environment changing, things like black swan events like we saw with COVID, things like what we saw in 2018 with the ELD mandates changing a lot of stuff. It can change in an instant. What we go through on the supply chain isn't always ebbs and flows and not always seasonality. Having access to high frequency data, like here in SONAR, and having all that stuff in one place gives you the ability to see trends as they're changing and jump ahead. So you're not just resting on your laurels, preparing for maybe next year the market is up or not. So can you walk us through a little bit about how we can do that within SONAR?
Yes, I definitely can. And the chart that we're looking at is quickly becoming one of my favorite charts that we put together in SONAR here, because like Jared was saying, it's not only about supply and demand, but it's also about those external factors that ultimately affect the supply chain, right? And this chart, looking at our outbound tender volume and our outbound tender rejections, which are displayed in the green line here, accurately show that pendulum swing from it being a carrier market to a shipper-centric market back to a carrier market. And we really see that, I think, fast-paced because of COVID as well. So we take a look back at 2018, where it really started, and where our data really started. And in 2018, you had trade wars. You had ELD mandates that were pushed out, and there was a lot of volatility in the market that way. We saw rejections just as high here as what we've been seeing the last few years because of COVID. But the volumes were very level, there wasn't a lot of demand or shifts in that demand to dictate the rejections we saw. But because of that, rates were high, and we saw a lot of capacity get added to the market because of that external volatility. So then when we get into 2019, I think anyone who was in the logistics industry at this point knows that that was a very soft, very shipper-centric year, somewhat similar to what we're dealing with now. And you can see those rejections were very low because of all of the surplus capacity that was added during the previous year. And if we go into the first couple months of 2020, that volume demand was identical to 2019 until we have that huge COVID spike over here. And that COVID spike really was the first iteration of the volatility that was to come. So we have that drop off with the lockdowns that were issued, and then we were on this uphill climb, through that volatility. Rejections were super high because we just had a mass exodus of capacity in 2019 because of a soft market. And here we are with demand through the roof at really probably historical levels here. And those rejections climbed along with it. So what did we do again? We added additional capacity. And you can see that those rejections started to decrease around the beginning of 2021, actually, because of all the capacity that was added, before we ever truly saw a drop off in the volume demand. So, fast forward again to the beginning of 2022, where we really saw consumer demand drop. We really saw the volume demand start to drop off, and those rejections essentially fell off a cliff and set new historical lows. And we're still dealing with that. I mean, on a national level, as of yesterday, we're at 3% in the rejections, which is incredibly low. That's basically everything getting accepted. We've got nothing moving on the spot market. And, spot market rates are starting to hit that floor.
Yeah, so I mean, just looking at this chart, you've got two different events that were somewhat unpredictable. I mean, we know the ELD mandates were coming into effect in 2018, but we didn't necessarily know what the effect would be on the market itself.
Yep.
So we see that time period where we have this overcapacity, or this lack of, capacity in the market from drivers having to change up the way that they operate and being able to, take these 700-mile loads, pick up in the afternoon, deliver early the next morning, so on and so forth. And then we see capacity flood into the market. And then now you have COVID that comes up, which nobody saw coming. That obviously put its own strain on the market. Now we're back down to lows. So we don't know what's next. I know that there's a lot going on in the world right now, but the best way to stay on top of that is by following this high frequency data and being able to figure out when it does happen, how is that going to affect us?
Right. And I think that's the question that's on everyone's mind is, this is great. We can explain this data, sure, from a historical perspective. Yeah, that's already happened. How do I keep my business ahead? How do I make sure that these events don't truly affect, the day-to-day business operations of your company. Yep. And the way that you can do that, or one of the ways that you can do that, is by looking at the imports. So roughly 75% of ocean imports are transferred into truckload volumes. And on this chart, we're looking at our IOTI data set, which is looking at those ocean bookings. So when shippers are actually sending the freight out to the ocean carriers. It gives you about a 4 to 6 week lead time before these volumes are actualized at the ports and ultimately before they're transferred into those truckload volumes. So imagine a month to a month and a half, even potentially 2 months lead time before you see those volumes in the truckload and before you have to actually react to them or make decisions off of them. You can be prepared and make sure your team is prepared for that. So take, for example, looking at this chart, and in 2022, around beginning of May, we really saw these imports start to drop. You could basically say they dropped off a cliff. Yep. We saw consumer demand falling. We saw, the ports were still dealing with a very heavy backlog from COVID. So we didn't actually start to feel this drop until around October, November, which is where the green line on here looking at your outbound truckload volumes really started to decrease. And once those ports worked through all of that backlog, we're now seeing a much closer near term, closer to that 4-6 week lead time into those truckload volumes. So if you're wondering when things are going to heat up, when we're going to start to see more truckload demand, watch the IOTI. This is going to be your leading indicator into when your team needs to be ready for the next increase.
Yep. Yeah, another benefit of having kind of everything in one place. You've got that macroeconomic data that leads into a lot of what the consumer demand is, that leads into what's going to come in from overseas, that's then going to lead into what we see here on the truckload market, intermodal market, any of those things. So again, stressing on that high frequency data and being able to see things as they're changing, as opposed to maybe studying historical data and guessing as to what might actually happen. Access to the high frequency data is really the value that can drive you forward in ensuring that you've got sustainability in your supply chain operations, no matter whether you're a shipper, carrier, broker, anything like that.